Don't you laugh at the poor man who doesn't speak too plain. Don't you laugh at him when he make an X for his name. Don't laugh at the little boy who lives down the street. Don't you laugh at the shoes on his feet. For you have many roads to travel, many burdens to bear. Before you take the road that's gonna carry you home. Oh, you got many roads to travel, many burdens to bear. Before you take the road, children, that's gonna carry you home. Don't you laugh at the poor girl with the hung down head. Don't laugh if she's a mother before she was wed. Don't laugh at the woman who toils night and day. Don't laugh at her, 'cause she only makes a half a pay. You got many roads to travel, many burdens to bear. Before you take the road to carry you home. Many roads to travel, many burdens to bear. Before you take the road to the home that's gonna carry you home. I wanna say it one more time. You take the road, carry you
All right, welcome everyone to our 2021 Work at the Ledge with the ACLU of Alabama. So excited to have you all here joining us. I'm going to go ahead and start off just by introducing myself as the mysterious voice behind the curtain. I am Dylan Nettles. I use he, him, his pronouns. I am the Policy and Advocacy Director for the ACLU of Alabama. And because I think we could all use a little bit of joy right now, it's been a rough few months, a rough last year, a lot that's gone on between last legislative session and this one. So I'll just say, two words that have made me very joyous this week, and that is Amanda Gorman. And I'm going to turn it over to my colleague, Steph.
Oh, I really like your joy of the week. That's so good. I love reading poetry, and I think yesterday that was probably my favorite part of the entire inauguration. So thank you for that. My name is Steph Bernal Martinez. I use she and her pronouns, and I'm part of the organizing and outreach crew at the ACLU of Alabama. And a joy that I actually was just talking about with my colleague Jasmine right before we started was like making very, very good playlists, like delicious playlists that you can like dance to, sing to, and just like feel good to. So that's a big joy I have right now. And I'll pass it off to Jasmine.
Hi, my name is Jasmine Peoples. I use pronouns she, her, and I'm with the communications department here at the ACLU of Alabama. And I'm providing tech support today for Steph and Dylan. And my joy this week has been my Nintendo Switch.
Jasmine, you still owe me some things on Animal Crossing. I would just like to point out.
I actually have like a bundle of things. I've been making like a little pile of things to give to you.
Perfect. I can't wait. Steph, do you want to go over our agenda for tonight?
Yes, thank you. Just so y'all know, the ACL of Alabama is slowly being taken over by people who are incredibly hooked on Animal Crossing. So I think I might actually join that team very soon because it seems really cute to play. Anyway, all right. So today we are coming together to work and to talk about three major aspects of legislative work. And so the first part today is we're going to do like a little 101, like how a bill becomes a law, little things like that. Then Dylan is going to bless us with a really good dive into the upcoming legislative session. And this year, every year is important, but this year is particularly important and different because of the pandemic. And so I'm really grateful for Dylan to break that down for us. And then last, we're going to deep dive into the ACLU's Smart Justice campaign. So that is some work that we've been doing for a little over a year now, maybe even longer. And it's a critical piece. It's the biggest piece of what our particular affiliate does. And so we're excited to share that with y'all. And at the very end of the webinar, we're going to do a Q&A with y'all. So if you have questions, please drop them either in the chat or use the little widget that is offered to you through Zoom. Like it should say Q&A on there. If you put a question in there, it makes it easy for us to come back to it at the end and be able to answer it. So I just wanted to name that real quick. All right, we can move forward. So like Dylan said just a second ago, it feels wild to say like, oh, this week has been chaotic or last week or this month, because really it's just been, I think it's just been overwhelming for many of us, the chaos and the hardship of the last year. And we do want to be able to like honor that things are hard right now and like own that and respect that, but also our movements will only survive if the movement is joyous. And so we do want to hear from y'all about what things are bringing you joy. So if you can take a moment to drop in the chat, like your name, your pronouns, and like something that's bringing you joy, that would be really helpful for us. So yeah, name, pronouns, what is bringing you joy, drop it in the chat. Thanks, y'all. I can see y'all sharing what's bringing you joy. This is beautiful to see. Yes, writing, getting politically involved, all of these things. Your cat, yes. Okay. Honestly, if it wasn't for playlists, the other thing that brings me joy is cats and my cat Ham, who is perfect. All right, we can move forward and folks can continue to drop their joys in the chat. All right, so this first part that we're going to get into, like I mentioned, is our little legislative advocacy 101. So this section is especially important for folks who feel maybe a little timid about what this work even looks like at the legislature, I am one of those people. I am not someone who is keen or has been skilled in this area for very long. And so I still am very nervous about interacting with legislators. So, all right, let's move forward. All right, so the very basic definition of legislative advocacy is this idea of these efforts to create and change policy through the legislative process, right? These efforts can look like so many different things. So it could be like talking to your legislators directly, you could be mobilizing people to come to a protest at the State House, or you could be learning about an issue with your community. All of those things are aspects of legislative advocacy. And later in this presentation, Dylan's going to talk to us about how COVID particularly will impact this upcoming legislative session, and how it'll add another layer to the work of advocacy. All right, so let's do a little temperature check with y'all. I appreciate everyone sharing their joys in the chat, but I also want to know, and Jasmine's going to open up a poll for us. I want to know like people's familiarity with interacting at the legislature, at the State House. Have you like ever written to a legislator? Have you ever called a legislator or met with them? Maybe you met with them like during an in-district meeting, or maybe you met with them at the State House. Go ahead and share your familiarity. And again, if you haven't, that's 100% okay. And Dylan knows this, my team knows this. Like before the ACLU of Alabama, I had no clue. I had never interacted with a legislator before that. That just wasn't my lane. It wasn't something I was interested in doing, but I've learned a lot from my peers here. I'll let folks vote a little bit more, a few more. All right, cool. I'm gonna wrap up this poll. And then maybe Jasmine, if you, again, I don't know if it'll let you, but maybe if you'll let us reveal the results to everyone.
People are still voting, so
Oh, okay.
it's gonna
I'll let people keep voting. I didn't mean to cut you off. I believe in everyone's right to vote.
We didn't ask her to say that.
I know that does sound like you know, very ACLU speak, but I do. Okay, it's looking so far from my end, from the back end. A lot of people have written letters and postcards and emails. Yeah, that's my favorite form of communication because I get very nervous talking to lawmakers.
Yeah, it looks like folks are almost split on also having called legislators before. And then less people, of course, have met with legislators, which is also totally not uncommon, something we'll talk a little bit about tonight.
Cool. Thank you, Jasmine, for sharing all those. And thank you all for taking our little poll. Great. So like Dylan shared, congrats to all of y'all. Every one of you have participated in some capacity in legislative advocacy, whether it looks like writing or meeting or talking to a legislator. So I know we're going to move forward, but like I mentioned a minute ago, a big piece of this work can look so many different ways. But one piece that I want folks to feel really excited about and eager to do together is the teaching and learning aspect. When we learn together, collective learning is a huge part of advocacy work. And so when we're teaching and learning together and from each other, we're building this very unique power that only belongs to us as constituents. And if Jasmine, you don't mind moving the slides forward. Thank you so much. So like I was saying, even the very act of us being on this webinar together is an aspect of legislative advocacy. So this learning process, you all are doing it in this moment. When we come together like this, we become a little bit more powerful in our ability to make really meaningful change in our state. All right. So we're gonna dive into the process of a bill becoming a law. And this is something that I totally struggle to commit to memory. And I often will have to refer back to, like, we have a reference sheet that breaks it down for us. And we'll send this resource to y'all after tonight's webinar, so you can also refer back to it. But for now, if you wanna go ahead and take a moment to scribble down what you know about this process, I'll give you all a second. Like, if you have a scratch sheet of paper by you, just like write down what you know. Just give you a moment, and then after a second or two, a moment or two, Dylan's gonna review this process for us. And I'll pass it to Dylan when he wants to bring y'all back. But yeah, take a moment.
Okay, so of course, if you all were kind of going through this process, you may have found, like, I don't know if I know as much about it as I thought, or some folks may have found that they actually know quite a bit. And we're gonna kind of walk through this, and you can kind of check your own work and see how it lines up with the process that we're going to explain. So Jasmine, let's go on to the next slide. So the first step is, of course, filing the bill. And a lot of folks actually have questions often about how that even starts. How do lawmakers write bills? How do they ultimately get filed? Well, the kind of the most succinct way to put it is that lawmakers oftentimes do not write their own bills. They certainly come with ideas, they come with suggestions, and for some of them, they may be really strong with writing on their own language, but there actually is a agency. It's the Legislative Services Agency. We call it LSA. There's an office in the State House, and lawmakers as well as lobbyists can go to LSA in order to get their bills filed, in order to get amendments and all types of things for their bills. And there's a whole staff there that kind of cranks that all out. And so oftentimes a bill starts just as an idea, something that not just a legislator can have, but any of us can have. And it, ultimately is created into this draft that gets filed, and then we can all see it publicly. Oftentimes when bills are filed, we see that they're already assigned to a committee. There's many committees, both in the Senate and the House chambers. And so those bills, when you see them first filed, will also have an assignment to a committee. And that kind of gives you an indication of where the bill is going to start, which takes us to our next step in the process. So after filing, the committee considers the bill. The committee could be, state government, it could be judiciary, it could be agriculture. It's going to usually be a committee that's relevant to the topic of the piece of legislation. The committee process is incredibly important, but also one of the aspects that we don't get to hear or see as much about. But this is probably one of the best opportunities for the public to make their voices heard, and to make their voices heard really loudly, frankly. You can place public hearings on pieces of legislation that have been filed. Any of us can do that. All we have to do is email the clerk on the committee, which can be found on the legislative website. And you can ask for a public hearing on a bill that has already been filed. You do have to request that public hearing before the bill is actually placed on an agenda and added to the website for a committee meeting. So basically, as soon as you see a bill filed and you think that it's really important, you've got something to say on it, you may want to go ahead and put a public hearing on that bill. So send that email to the committee clerk. And if there's others that have one already on there, then that's okay. They'll usually let you know. In normal times, you would come to the State House and you would get a chance to speak during the public hearing, but we're going to talk a little bit more about the changes in this upcoming session and how they'll be navigating some of the COVID-19 protocols. So let's go on to the next slide, Jasmine. So should a bill actually make it through committee and be passed out of the committee, then it will ultimately at some point have the opportunity to go to the floor. Now, that doesn't mean that it always will happen. There are lots of bills that get out of committee and then they are not actually ever added to what we call a calendar. And that is essentially what the chamber's agenda for the day, the work plan for the day, if you will. So calendars are produced multiple times throughout the week. And when we get those calendars, we can see what's going to be up for floor debate. There's a committee actually called the Rules Committee that sets those calendars in both chambers. And that's how they determine what makes it from the committee onto the actual floor for debate. And again, it doesn't always happen. So just because a bill gets out of committee doesn't mean it will be prioritized and put onto the floor. There's a whole kind of technical process that happens in Rules Committee for that ultimately to happen. But if it does get onto the floor, then it will be debated, and members can come to the well and present their arguments from each side ultimately before it is up for passage. Let's go on to the next slide. Uh-oh, looks like we skipped ahead one maybe, but that's okay. So after a bill gets voted on, if it ultimately is in fact passed through one chamber, then it will go through that same process on the other side of the legislative body. So once it's passed through the Senate, it will ultimately go over to the House. It will start back at a committee. It will have to be passed out of the committee. It will ultimately have to go back to the floor at some point for debate, and then it will have to be passed through the other chamber in order to ultimately go on to the governor, who will sign it or veto the bill. All right, let's go on to the next slide. Steph, I think this is you.
All right, so thank you, Dylan, for helping us understand that process. And I know that he shared a lot of really good information. And again, it's not something you necessarily have to commit to memory. It's actually something that I think is muscle memory. If you are participating in this process on a daily basis, you would generally understand it the way that Dylan does. But many of us don't have to do Dylan's job. And so we have resources to help us remember. And we will send those to y'all. So I'm going to pivot and talk about how us as constituents can engage in the process that Dylan laid out for us. So right before I do that, I just want you all to take a moment to share how y'all have participated. Just share in the chat. Any ideas are valid. Like, how do you engage in effective legislative advocacy? Again, remember, it can look like so many things. So feel free to share in the chat. Yep, I see people saying lobby day, sharing your stories. Absolutely. We can move on to the next slide. Town halls, emails, calls. Yep, absolutely. I love that. Harassing elected officials' emails. Yes, fill up that inbox. So the first thing that I wanted to share, I'm going to share 3 major elements of engaging in this work. But the first one that we're going to talk about is how we explore the problem our community has and how we can best understand our issues. So this is number 1. Before we start, like you said, harassing our lawmakers, this is where we start. Sometimes we're going to be pushing to pass new legislation, and it's also possible that you, your organization, or a coalition of Alabamians might be trying to get a legislator to even simply consider the creation of a new bill that addresses your issue and solves your problem, right? So, for example, we've seen communities right now who are experiencing extreme acute health crises that are only exacerbated by COVID-19, and lack of healthcare access is a huge problem. So one example is the Save Ourselves Coalition here in Alabama has recognized this problem in their community and is now pushing for an expansion of Medicare and fighting for Medicare for all. The coalition itself has transformed this problem in their community into an issue to fight for. So oftentimes in Alabama, unfortunately, we're going to be playing defense to block bills that infringe upon the civil rights of our people, right? So, for example, in 2019, HB 314, the Human Life Protection Act, which is also the abortion ban, pulled together folks across the state to fight against the passage of this bill that would hugely limit and infringe on people's reproductive rights, right? So individuals and organizations, if y'all remember, came together to explore this like incredibly problematic bill, and they worked together collaboratively to fight against its passage. We can go ahead and move to the next slide. So we've talked about how folks come together to like understand their problem and figure out what they're up against. And once we do that, we want to then get very specific about our demands. So being effective legislative advocates requires us to really zoom in on what we want and also who can give it to us. That's like a critical piece of organizing work, of advocacy work that tends to be forgotten sometimes, even though it feels really obvious, but then, and that's okay, which is something we have to remember. In the case of the abortion ban, Alabamians who fought against it made it very, very clear that their demand was to protect reproductive freedoms. And their targets, fortunately for them, I guess, were laid out right in front of them because their targets were legislators who had been openly in favor of the ban. So they knew what they wanted and they knew exactly who could give them what they wanted. Sometimes it can be a real challenge to know who to target, but there are resources and people and organizations who can help us make those determinations. Oftentimes they're people like Dylan. So Dylan's work at the legislature is identifying who are the legislators who can give us what we want as constituents. So we need to lean into those kinds of resources who can help us understand that. All right, lastly, and this is sort of like how we summarize how we bring our work together as legislative advocates. Our path to effective advocacy is taking very meaningful action. So your strategy is built on what you learned about your issue, right? In the beginning, you studied your issue, you understood it, and you identified your targets. You were able to really figure out your demands. So now your tactics, which are all of the actions that you're going to take to get your demands met, are these critical pieces of your overall strategy. So during the abortion ban, individuals and organizations used a variety of tactics as part of this strategy. So some of the things we saw protests at the State House, we saw letter writing campaigns. I don't know if other folks remember this, but I remember seeing a literal plane in the sky. There was an action where folks had a plane in the sky with a message banner flying across the State House. So like that was a tactic. Other folks used popular cultural references as part of a sit-in at the Capitol. I don't know if you remember this, but some folks wore these red costumes from The Handmaid's Tale. And all of these were tactics that were utilized to serve the overall strategy in getting what folks want. Sometimes all of these pieces of legislative advocacy are not necessarily, do not deliver the results we want, and that's also okay. In the case of the abortion ban, like it had to actually just take it up a step further and get into a formal lawsuit. But before we even deep dive into that, I'm just gonna go ahead and pass it off to Dylan, who's actually gonna guide us through what this year's session is gonna look like and what the ACLU of Alabama specifically is gonna focus on.
Thanks so much for covering just those really critical and essential pieces of how we organize and build power. I've been around the legislature for the last couple of years now, and everything that Steph has told you is absolutely positively the case. We have to know our targets, we have to be clear about our demands, and we have to come up constantly with creative and unique tactics in order to advance the work that we want to see, and especially here in Alabama, where the political climate, especially on the work of civil liberties and civil rights, is tough. And so we have to continue those to push in new and different ways. Thank you so much for that, Steph. So as we move into the 2021 legislative session, I want to talk to you first a little bit about what we should expect in terms of how COVID-19 will impact this next session. And as we go to the next slide, we're also going to drop for you all a link to actually an article that just came out earlier today regarding some additional announcements that we heard from the speaker. And I'll just kind of consolidate some of this information into three categories really, which is public access, how the calendar of the legislator will look, and then committees and public hearings, which I referenced earlier. So we're going to drop this link in the chat so you all can get more details about this. But in terms of the public access, members of the public will be required to wear masks in the State House, which will be open, but with some limitations. So walk-through temperature scanners are set up at each public entrance, and a limited number of areas will be available for public viewing. If you've been in the State House and spent some time around there, you know that typically we have rooms, including the gallery in both chambers, that folks can congregate in and kind of watch and observe what's happening on the floor. Oftentimes also during committee meetings, we spend time in those committee rooms listening in on the various discussions. That will be significantly limited this year. In-person meetings also with legislators will be limited. So in addition to 6-foot social distancing requirements in place and hand sanitizers and all of those things, you will be required to make appointments for visits with Senate offices, and you will have some limited access to folks in the House. There's many more members there, of course. And so from what we're being told is in order to get to some of those offices, you will essentially have to be escorted. You will have a limited amount of time to do your business, talking to a lawmaker, and then you will be escorted out. The House and Senate will both offer video live streaming from their chambers from a limited number of committee rooms. That's actually something a bit new. There's always, for those of you who have tried, there's always been some criticism of the technology in the State House and the public access as far as live streaming and other things like that, especially for those people who are not in Montgomery. It can be very tough to watch and observe what's going on. Well, they've done some upgrades, and we're being told that they will offer video live streaming from both the chambers, and that at least 5 committee rooms will have also some live video and audio streaming. Now, I also mentioned earlier that committee meetings might be limited, and that also will affect public hearings. We still, frankly, don't have a lot of these details disclosed from Speaker McCutcheon or anyone else in leadership yet. And so we're hoping that that will be announced and clarified still ahead of the session. As I mentioned, committee meetings are incredibly important for the public to be heard. But right now, we haven't been told that there's going to be any ways for virtually the public to dial in or leave messages or even make a live testimony in a public hearing. That only leads us to believe that in order to do so, you would have to come into the State House, which I certainly am not encouraging anyone to do. So we just have to kind of wait and see how that shakes out. We also know that because of the limited number of committee rooms, that also means that there will likely be a limited number of committee meetings that actually take place. The House and Senate normally meet on Tuesdays and Thursdays with committee meetings on Wednesdays. And Speaker McCutcheon has announced that they will, for the first 2 weeks of session, actually convene on the floor Tuesday, Wednesday, and Thursday to debate and handle business. And then they will go into a recess that will mean that their last day will be on Thursday, February 11th. They will go on at least a week and return on February 23rd. And so some significant shakeups with the calendar there. That just essentially means that we will start for 2 weeks, and then we will go immediately into a recess as they kind of assess how COVID impacts, the other lawmakers or the staff. Frankly, they just are anticipating that there may be a potential outbreak, and they want to, I hope, mitigate some of that. And so I suppose that this is the proposal that they have put forward. It's their proposal, not mine, but it is a proposal. And those have been details that have been announced to all of the lawmakers and now are accessible to the public as well. All right, let's go on to the next slide, Jasmine. Okay, so you can always find new information about the ACLU's priorities, about what we're following, tracking in the legislature as the session continues to evolve. And of course, we'll try to include updates for you all there regarding any changes to how the committees will be structured, where you can find information about live streaming. All of those things we'll continue to try to keep updated on our legislative website page. You can find that, of course, at aclualabama.org. We also, as we actually walk through in a few minutes, our upcoming priorities, you'll see already on our website that those are listed. So let's go on to the next slide. Okay, so we're going to talk about some of our priorities for this session. And there's so much that I could talk about. Of course, if any of you follow the ACLU's work closely, you know we have just a really wide umbrella here at this organization. That means a lot of issues are sometimes too often in Alabama causes for concern for us. But we're excited also about some actual proactive opportunities in this session, and that starts us off really with voting, which is certainly a part of our agenda this year. There's been a number of voting bills that fortunately have already been pre-filed. You can see those on the screen. Every one of these is already a bill that has been filed and is sponsored. The first three, HB 82, HB 83, and HB 84, are all sponsored by Representative Laura Hall. These are bills that would actually substantially expand voter access in Alabama. You can see here by a number of ways. She actually includes a pathway here for felony reenfranchisement for people who have already lost their voting rights due to a felony conviction. She's also actually got a bill that would allow for ID cards to be given as a valid form of voter ID to currently incarcerated people who are still eligible to vote. And she also has introduced a bill that would provide for no excuse absentee voting across the state, something that actually in this past election cycle, a lot of us got to probably enjoy for the first time, actually using absentee voting as our mode of voting instead of going in on election day and doing it that way. That's a door that we certainly don't think that should be closed back at the ACLU. And we actually think we should go even further, which is why I've listed here Representative John Rogers' bill on early voting, which would provide for 5 early voting days in Alabama in the week prior to the election. This doesn't include any weekends in the legislation. And that's something that I know many advocates are also concerned about, especially as we think about ways to reach people who may not be able to easily get to a voting center, during the weekdays. And so, with any legislation that's pre-filed, it's always great to start looking at those bills, reading up on them, and considering changes or suggestions that you may have for a lawmaker, whether it be the sponsor or your actual lawmaker in your district who could go and perhaps lobby on your behalf. It's always just a good idea to start checking out these bills and forming some opinions on your own, because you can certainly influence and shape how these bills ultimately look by the time they reach final passage, and we see it all the time. So we'll go on to the next priority. This is actually going to be a defensive priority for the ACLU, and it's not, unfortunately, our first time going to battle on this issue in particular. In 2020, lawmakers across the country set out to target trans youth with ill-conceived and dangerous bills attempting to restrict survival opportunities for young people who are transgender. And this included Alabama bills that targeted trans youth in sports and the healthcare of trans youth. Unfortunately, we have seen this attack return in the 2021 session. As you can see here from the bill numbers, in the House, it's the very first bill that's been filed, and it's not far down from that in the Senate. These proposals actually regulate clinicians and or parents and actually impose criminal penalties on those individuals for a range of things. And so we're going to kind of talk through that now. So first of all, in this bill, we would see, and again, this is a return from from last session, this bill would actually criminalize not only physicians who provide gender-affirming care, such as hormone therapy or hair removal, voice modification, and other completely reversible non-surgical procedures for youth. It would actually penalize them with a Class C felony that could lead up to 10 years of jail time here in a state where we need competent and willing physicians to stick around, to feel that they are welcome here, that they don't have to worry about a criminal penalty for simply doing their jobs. We think that that's very dangerous to introduce, but it actually goes further than even just physicians. It's actually quite vague in the legislation and leaves open to interpretation what happens to nurses, to counselors, to teachers, principals, other administrative officials at a public or private school who do really a number of things. It actually outlines in the legislation that it could be considered a criminal penalty to encourage or coerce a minor to withhold from the minor's parents or legal guardian the fact that the perception of his or her gender is inconsistent with their sex. And that's the actual language that I'm quoting from the bill. It also outlines that withholding from a minor's parent or legal guardian information related to a minor's perception that his or her gender or sex is inconsistent with his or her sex, excuse me. So it's actually going to go even beyond the physician. It's going to go into the folks who are interacting probably on the day-to-day with trans youth. It could be their teachers, it could be counselors, people that they trust to open up to. Those people could now actually be at risk of spending jail time and being prosecuted because of, again, they're just doing their job. So the truth is that trans and gender diverse people experience significant health disparities as it is, and an increased burden of disease, specifically in the areas of mental health, HIV, violence, and victimization. And many of these health disparities can be avoided. They originate from a place of discrimination and systemic biases that decrease access to care, as well as from health professional ignorance. And introducing legislation like this, which has been brought by Representative Allen and Senator Shelnut, is just simply only going to take us into a really dark path forward for young people in our state who are already struggling and who need care, who need support from us all. And so the ACLU will adamantly oppose this piece of legislation, and we will go back to bat for this issue in the upcoming session. So we're going to talk a little bit more about HFOA, but I'm going to move us along, for the sake of time, but also so that you all can get a little bit of details about our campaign for smart justice. As Steph mentioned, it's a really prominent piece of our work here at the ACLU of Alabama, and then we'll circle back to HFOA before we get to your questions. Okay, so what is the Campaign for Smart Justice? The ACLU Campaign for Smart Justice is really a multi-year nationwide effort that we undertook starting in 2016 with the goal of decreasing incarceration by 50% in the US jail and prison population. So why do we need to focus on decarceration in Alabama? Well, frankly, I'd love to hear you all's thoughts on this, so please drop those in the chat. But we're gonna walk through them a bit, and we're gonna start off by letting Steph talk a bit about the racial disparities that we see.
I really appreciate Molly's response, because Molly in the chat said, how much time do you have? Because that really is how I feel. Bro, where do you start? Absolutely. So one of the biggest reasons that we need to focus on decarceration in Alabama, and this is we're sharing the position of our campaign, is because of these anti-Black and racist origins of the prison system, and obviously of the criminal justice system more broadly. So we're talking prisons, policing, parole, probation, all of these are rooted in a racist past. These racial disparities in Alabama's prison population are indicative of this origin story. In Alabama, Black folks constitute about 26% of the state's total population, but Black folks make up over 50% of the prison population. Obviously, the goal is not simply to make sure that white people and Black people are punished and incarcerated at the same rates. That's not the work that we're here to do. Our work under the Campaign for Smart Justice requires us to think and consider and examine why these disparities exist in Alabama and across the country, because this is not just an Alabama issue. This is not just a Southern issue. This is across the country. We can look at the teachings of abolitionist organizers and thinkers to help us contextualize these disparities. And this is my little like disclaimer, Dylan and I have to do this all the time, because as a side note and for complete transparency, the ACLU is, as a national organization and as an affiliate, is not an abolitionist organization, even if it's something that on a personal level we may align with. So here are some of the histories that abolitionist organizers and thinkers recognize that would better help all of us in this work. So I'm going to share a little bit about this. So shortly after the Civil War, a series of laws and policies and practices referred to as the Black Codes were enacted to sort of like, to limit and control Black life throughout the country, and not exclusively in the South. I think that's an important thing for us to remember. These Black codes criminalized the most mundane and normal human actions. For example, formerly enslaved people were criminalized for not having paid work, for example, or not having paid work that was like, quote, officially authorized or sanctioned or deemed appropriate by these very arbitrary standards created by white government officials. Other examples of criminalized activity under the Black codes included public group gatherings, but often public group gatherings were defined as more than one single Black person. So like if you are simply walking home with another person in your family, that is a criminal act. These Black codes benefited white landowners who no longer had access to unpaid laborers. These Black codes worked in hand with the 13th Amendment that allowed for the use of forced and unpaid labor. And this is the big caveat that, folks, if you've seen the film 13th, as punishment for a crime, right? We've really focused on that. That is the caveat in that amendment. This is where we see the origins of convict leasing, which is a practice actually that Alabama still utilizes today. Last year, for the first time in the legislative session, I had an opportunity to tour the legislature, the State House, and I learned that all of the furniture in our State House floor was made through the labor of incarcerated people throughout Alabama. After the failure of Reconstruction in the South and the expansion of these Black codes, so what I was describing there was like pre-Reconstruction, shortly after slavery was abolished, but these just expanded through Jim Crow segregation. We see amplified and explicit criminalization of, again, the most mundane and normal human actions. And we know what that means, right? So we can also see these contemporary manifestations of these codes through things like truancy laws, vagrancy laws, laws that criminalize poverty. We're seeing it happen right now in front of our eyes as we see police lead evictions, as we're seeing people being displaced, right? So this is just to say that this isn't history. This is a very contemporary thing that is happening. So I'm going to pass it back to you, Dylan.
Sure. So the legacy of all of these things that Steph just named absolutely continue today. I saw someone already mention this in the chat when I presented my question earlier, but we know that there's now been multiple investigations by the U.S. Department of Justice, which have concluded that Alabama's prisons for men were in violation of constitutional and human rights. After exhausting multiple opportunities for the Alabama Department of Corrections and the state leaders to address these issues through policy and protocol changes, the U.S. Department of Justice did file a lawsuit against the state of Alabama and the Department of Corrections just last year, at the end of last year, citing these violations under the 8th and the 14th Amendments. So why are we talking about the Habitual Felony Offender Act? This is essentially Alabama's 3 strikes law, and everything that we're talking about is crystallized in this law, truly. It creates widespread sentencing disparities and unjustly incarcerates too many people for, frankly, far too long. It's overly punitive, and it's what has really driven these horrendously overcrowded prisons. HFOA's effect on Alabama's prison system was immediate and dramatic. The law was passed in 1977, and Alabama's prisons incarcerated at that time fewer than 4,000 people, y'all. By the year 2000, the system designed to hold 13,000 was bursting with over 25,000 people. Now, today there are over 6,100 people serving longer enhanced sentences under Alabama's Habitual Felony Offender Act, with over 1,100 serving life sentences and 527 of them serving life without parole sentences, which is the harshest possible punishment next to the death sentence. Because of these lengthy sentences, that means that 30% of the HFOA population in Alabama's prisons is over the age of 50. As people age out of criminal behavior, which many studies support, the cost to keep them incarcerated doubles. The average cost per day of incarcerating someone in Alabama is about $64. Our proposal at the ACLU is to repeal the Habitual Felony Offender Act and provide an avenue for parole or resentencing for each person incarcerated under this law. So I won't spend too much time here because I do want to make sure we have time to get to your questions. But we talked a bit earlier about the racial disparities that we saw in some of those laws that ultimately evolved into the HFOA law that we see today. We also, due to data from the Alabama Sentencing Commission that I just referenced, know that 527 people were, as of October 2019, serving life without parole for offenses other than murder. So I think it's really just important to emphasize some of these numbers and the breakdowns you see here, not because we think that, frankly, people deserve to be kind of locked in a cell and thrown away the key no matter their offense, but I think that there's a negative and false association with people who are sentenced under HFOA and automatically they're considered to be these significant threats to the public. I mentioned earlier that people are actually age out of what is considered criminal behavior, but also, frankly, we know that people who do commit what are considered crimes of physical injury or sometimes references violent crimes, they actually also are less likely to recommit. And so the numbers we see here are really troubling because we know that a lot of these folks are suffering under that connotation and in fact could be, again, have their cases looked at, resentenced, or possibly even given the opportunity for a real parole hearing. So Steph, I'll turn it back to you.
Thank you. All right, so we're talking real briefly, quick, a little how we're doing this. So first and foremost, the thing that I would just really want to highlight is that we really care about the process of this work, that we're organizing to build power and not exclusively just to have final outcomes, not to just say, oh, we have this shiny new policy or we have X, Y, and Z reform. We want to build power amongst oppressed people and people who are directly impacted. You can go to the next slide. So one way that we are doing this is by participating in a coalition called Communities Not Prisons, and they are working to block the construction of 3 new mega prisons. And our work with that is to support this leadership and this work of directly impacted people. Another way that we are and we can go to the next slide. Another way that we are doing this work, we have been collaborating with folks in the Alabamians for Fair Justice Coalition for a little over a year now. Last year, this coalition pulled together a massive lobby day of folks all across the state who are interested in criminal justice reform work. And they came to the State House and they talked to the legislators and they pushed for policies that would improve the material conditions of people across Alabama. And the last thing that I want to mention before we jump into y'all's questions is we are just now in the infancy of starting a pen pal program with folks who are incarcerated in Alabama's prisons. Our goal here obviously is to build meaningful relationships with people who are incarcerated. That's been our goal from the jump, but right now we're leaning into a program where you could participate as well. And we'll send around the link to y'all after the webinar. Oh, and look, Jasmine already has it for us in the chat, but I'll also send it after the webinar. All right, so I'm gonna pivot us into a couple of ways, just naming a couple of things that you could do to get involved, and then we'll open up for questions. So like I just mentioned, these are the 3 things, the 3 opportunities that y'all have. And we actually have a little poll for y'all. I think I could pull it up for us. see. Yeah, I can do it. I got it, Jasmine, in case you can hear me. All right, good. So if you're interested in any of these opportunities to either organize with the Communities Not Prisons Coalition or Alabamians for Fair Justice, who's doing advocacy work at the State House, or if you're interested in becoming a pen pal, just go ahead and vote in the chat. I will be sure to connect y'all to the appropriate people and plug you into this really important work. So I'll let you all continue to chat there, but I do also want to open it up for questions. So yeah, I wonder if we have any questions. If you have questions, please drop them in the chat.
Yes, Steph, it looks like some have already come in the Q&A, and folks feel free to continue voting, feel free to continue submitting some questions. I'll just try to hit on a couple of these that I see have come in. So one question was, when are the prisons going to release the COVID vaccine for people who are incarcerated in Alabama? This was a multi question. So are there going to be any bills introduced on prison reform, and are they still planning on building the prisons with the opposition from taxpayers? So I'll try to sum all of that up in a succinct answer. We have not heard about any protocols that have been released so far from ADOC with regard to how people who are currently incarcerated will be prioritized. We have not seen any information also from the Alabama Health Department about incarcerated people being included in the initial phase 1 rollout of the vaccine. That is something that other states, we see folks mobilizing around. Certainly with Alabamians for Fair Justice, we've kind of tried to keep the heat on ADOC, especially around some of the conditions and situations that have arose as COVID initially began to sweep the facilities. So that is something that I'm sure that we will pursue in the near future, but I haven't heard anything so far. As far as bills that have been introduced on prison reform, we have seen some things already dropped into pre-file. I don't want to be a negative nanny, but I have to always kind of give my professional assessment. It's nothing I think that's been filed so far that I would consider significant in its impact on the prison population or the current conditions. There are some things regarding sentencing guidelines that would impact mostly nonviolent offenders, but not much that goes beyond that. There is also legislation that's been introduced to provide a additional panel of parole members. That would be 3 additional special appointed parole members. A lot of you know that the prison crisis is exacerbated by the parole crisis that's happening. Alabama essentially shut down paroles multiple times really in the recent years, but has, even when they're actively holding parole hearings, paroled very few people, especially again, those with violent offenses. And for a while, we've had a problem with even getting an adequate number of hearings a week going. So there is a proposal that's been introduced by Representative Jim Hill, who's the House Judiciary Chair, to actually include additional parole board members so that they can expedite more hearings a week. And from what we're being told, the governor certainly is still pursuing her plan for prison construction. There is a lot of opposition, fortunately, in these communities, and Steph lifted up that getting involved in the Communities Not Prisons campaign is just one way to get involved in that fight against the $1.2 billion tax plan. I also want to lift up that the Alabama Students Against Prisons have been doing incredible work and taking actions around the state and virtually in recent weeks to really take elected officials to task on their support for these prisons or their silence on the prison construction issue. I think there's probably some of those students in the chat, so feel free to drop any of you all's information there as well. Let's see here.
We have a lot of really good questions, and I made sure to screenshot them, Dylan, just so you know, so that we can, like, even if we can't answer now, we can definitely at least respond to people later on.
Absolutely, absolutely.
So we have one question in the chat, or one note about the focus on the racist histories or the origins. I think Claude brought up this question around like bringing up the quote, the race card. And so I just wanted to address that real quick. It's important for us to reckon with the fact that this system was designed in a particular way to harm and to target Black people, Black communities, Black life. And it's absolutely not exclusive to the detriment of Black people. And it also wraps up white humanity in that violence, right? And so something that I've been taught a lot from the people who do this work is like, yes, Black folks are the target, but white and working class people are collateral damage in a system that is based off of the subjugation of Black people. So I think it's really important that that point is considered, because often we're like, well, it doesn't just impact Black people. You are absolutely right. And this is why we should be more committed to talking about the racist origins and how it hurts everybody. So I'll pass it back to you, Dylan.
Thank you so much for that very clear explanation, Steph. So many great questions. I'm just going to say a couple of broad things that hopefully we'll hit on a number of questions. And like Steph said, we will save them and try to respond to some of them also following this webinar. Right now, we are still in kind of a holding pattern. We are going into session with a couple of bills that I mentioned that are pre-filed that we think address in some big ways and some small ways some of our concerns on the criminal justice side of things. However, again, we are pushing for the habitual felony bill because we think that we have to have strong changes in order to make a really significant impact on the overcrowding that we're seeing in the facilities, and that we should also be shifting our attention towards treatment and rehabilitation for people who are incarcerated or formerly incarcerated, rather than continuing this cycle. I also, saw a question about the death penalty and abolition for death penalty in Alabama. We haven't seen legislation, I think, in quite some time introduced to abolish the death penalty in Alabama, and I haven't heard anything about any this year, but those are the type of examples, I think, of legislation that we absolutely would support, but also that goes much further than the type of things we're seeing. All of that being said, we know that it's going to be a lengthy session. We're starting out in February. Typically a session will run, to May to even possibly June. With that session, every week, every day, there could be new bills filed, and we always have to kind of keep our eye out for what's coming. And when we do, we respond, we get it up on our website, we try to get information to our supporters so that you all are aware. And so we'll be continuing that, of course, in this session, especially with changes that will probably happen rapidly. So don't think that because something hasn't been filed yet, or because we're not talking about it yet, that it's off our radar. The ACLU doesn't care, or that lawmakers still won't. Certainly with our influence and our urgency that we're, as a public pushing on these issues, that lawmakers will and still can bring really impactful legislation that we all hope to see. So we're just starting out. We hope that you all will kind of take up all the tools that we have discussed tonight and that we have offered, and that you will continue to remain engaged and following along with our work, so that we can be a community of folks who are really watchdogs for the legislature, and who are beating down their doors, beating down the block, whatever we have to do in order to make sure that they know that we are present and that we are watching. So thank you all so much for your time tonight. I hope that you felt that this was all meaningful, useful information. Please, please, please feel free to always reach out to us. And if you have any feedback on this discussion tonight, I'm always open to hear it. We want to continue to improve and make sure that we're providing the right information that you all want to hear in these type of trainings. So thank you all so much. I hope you have a good evening.
And just one very last thing, because folks, this question is important. How will we communicate with you after this? Through email. So make sure that you get a chance to check out the exit survey that is going to go around after the webinar. You'll probably get it tomorrow at the latest. And I've also captured y'all's emails when you registered. So that's how I will plug you in. So I know someone asked how we'll communicate with you on the actions. Just keep an eye on your email inbox. All right. Thanks, y'all.